evening, everybody. It is I, Nick Pennsylvania, here as ever with my good friend Brendan Bond. Evening, Brendan.
Evening, Nick.
It has been a little while. It has been the holiday season, and we were talking about, well, we're finally back into things. We had some moving around over at my house. Nothing major, but just moving some stuff around, and you've got a new cat with you.
I do. She's not in the room currently, but I have a little cat named Crunchy. She is a little black void, and I love her very much.
Very good. And as you said, it's been a few weeks since we've been on because of the holidays and everything. And right before we started recording, you said something to the effect that it is time to empty the eggnog and replenish that chalice with spooky stuff. And that's what we're going to be getting down to here in a moment. But in the time that we were away, we got some comments on a couple of our more recent episodes. I wanted to read them to you and get your impressions. Do you want the critical or the just general comment first? I'll give you the...
Let's go with the critical first, because we like those. So.
Yeah, this comes from King Flippy Nips. And this was regarding the Shenango Stranges, and that's when we interviewed our friend, the Kings. They had found that plaster, they had found a footprint. They took a plaster cast. It was a comment on dogmen and all of that. But this person responded, if you don't count the nail and the overflow of plaster, which should have been trimmed off the cast, then the print is only about 8.5 inches. And as also the guess was wrong. When dogs and wolves sit down, they plant their entire foot down. They also do it when standing on their hind legs with the paw belonging to that print. It is not so very wide at all either. The toes were spread apart by the mud or dirt pushing between them and making it look larger. And once again, there's excess plaster which should have been trimmed off the sides. It's about a 2.5 inch wide paw. That print is nothing more than a very small wolf or a medium large sized dog. Hell, my medium sized cat has about a 6 inch long paw print. An 8.5 to 2.5 inch paw print is just plain average for a number of canines. A lichened dog has a much larger paw than that, and it is 50% wolf and 50% German Shepherd. So that was, and I thought, okay, I don't know anything about dog paw prints. And I basically responded back with, I did appreciate the comment.
For sure.
Yeah. And I said, we'll bring this up with Jamie, and let's see, what is it? And encourage them to compare some dog prints with the cast that they have. And we know Jamie spoke about going to bring this to some wildlife officers. My hope would be that a wildlife officer would very quickly be able to say, oh, no, this isn't unusual. I can't tell you maybe exactly what it is, but this isn't outside the range. So maybe there's something there. I don't know. But I did appreciate the comment. So it was a little critical, but they're listening. And
for sure.
had to listen to most of it to get to there. So
right, which we appreciate
that.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting because again, really appreciate the comment first and foremost, and for someone to take the time out of their day to do that. Like Jamie was very clear about how like this is not his normal mode of operation, so maybe that's something for him to take into account in the future, is like getting samples of what the strata is like in the earth, getting samples of like, were they all the same, were because it's not like every one would be them sitting down if like the commenter mentioned, so probably more information is needed in that sense to satisfy that maybe.
No, the best evidence you can bring, you always want to make sure when you're taking any sort of evidence that you're getting as much information and that is as accurate as possible. So right. No, I did appreciate the comment. Now the other one, and this was nice, I think our greatest title comes from you, and that is episode 67, the Spectral Scholastic Mule.
Yes. Yes.
So a little while ago, a listener, Ricky Grant, came back to us and he said, yes, when I was there in the mid to late 2000s, I remember seeing old Coley in a glass museum display case in the hub, complete with interpretive text like an exhibit.
Oh
So just
wow.
yeah, just someone reaching out who not only was familiar with the story, not only is an alum, but
Yeah.
had also seen the exhibit which you spoke about. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah. I'm sorry, who did you say the commenter was on that one?
Oh goodness, I'm gonna have to go. I clicked out
I'm
of it. It
sorry.
was
I'm
no, no,
sorry.
no. I'll go right. It takes me 2 seconds here to. It was Ricky Grant.
Oh, Ricky. Yeah, no, me and Ricky used to work together and play D&D together for a while. He's a good dude. I'm very happy to
Okay.
hear he's listening. So if you're out there, Ricky, how's it going, bud?
Well, very cool. Yeah, that was nice. So now, now that we've emptied the eggnog, it is time to replenish that chalice with the spooky stuff, as you said earlier,
Yeah.
which I wrote down because I thought that was hilarious. So I have being presented by Bond yet again with a story that I am not familiar with. And anytime this happens, well, really, this is a two-way street. Anytime one of us brings to the other a story and we learn that the other is not already familiar with it, we get very excited and we call a meeting. And basically, the person that's not already familiar has to fight the urge to look anything and everything up about the subject. So I have done that. This is the story of the Green Children of Woolpit. So go right ahead.
Yeah, so this is one of those stories that I heard in passing quite a few times on just different programs and podcasts and stuff, and even mentioned just kind of again in a passing way in some of the books that we read. When we were trying to think of stuff to talk about, a few weeks ago, I was like, "What's this whole Green Children of Wool Pit thing?" So I wanted to actually look into it and see what the story was. And as per usual, this kind of reminds me of our Wizard Clip episode. Once you look into it, it's like, boy, this just gets like weirder and weirder.
Well, and even the name, it's two unlike things thrown together: wool and pit, wizard and clip.
Right.
Yeah, the wizard clip is one of those stories that definitely stuck with me because, there's a lot of these spooky stories where you can almost, like, anytime I watch one of those haunted house shows or ghost shows, I
Yeah.
can almost tell you the story just from the backdrop of the scene. That
Right.
wizard clip was very different.
Yes. Yes. This story, for those of you who aren't familiar with this takes place in the 1100s. So this is one of our older stories. And it takes place in a place called Wool Pit, which is which is near it's in the eastern side of England. Yeah, it's outside, it's near Cambridge, in England. So it's on like the southeastern side of a state, not state, country. It's like northeast of London a little bit. So not an area that we talk about too often, but an area that is rife with stories because they've had a lot of stuff going on there over the years. So what this story is about, it's about what the title says. It is about green children with green skin, which is kind of weird. You don't hear that too often. So what happened in this village of Wool Pit? And the reason it's called Wool Pit is because they actually had wolf pits, like WOLFPITS, that they would dig to keep the livestock safe. And it's literally like those old school traps where like you put stuff over the ground, things walk onto it and they fall in, keeping the wolves at bay. So people are out harvesting, like they do in the English countryside in the 1100s, and out of nowhere, two young children are found. Their skin was green, and they spoke an unknown language, and the material that made up their clothing was foreign. People didn't know what this was. So people were obviously concerned. Two kids just wandering around in the fields. They're green. They can't understand what they're saying. They look strange for a few reasons. So they take him to one of the locals named Richard Clane, Clane. I'm not sure if he was an abbot or like a canon or something. He had something to do with the church, but wasn't like a priest or anything. They took the children in and were trying to like help them out and everything, obviously. One of the weird things they noticed right away too, besides the color of the skin, how they looked, how they dressed, how they talked, they wouldn't eat any of the food that they had. And it wasn't until they came across raw fava beans, like the kind that Cannibal Lecter talks about, they ate those. just fine. After a while, they started to eat regular food the people just like normally had in the area and everything. And the children seemed to, after besides being a little malnourished, seemed relatively healthy. Now, after a while, they wanted to baptize the children because that's a good way to make sure that their souls are safe. And before this happened, the younger of the two, of the boy and the girl, the boy actually became like sickly and died right around the time of the baptism. So the girl stayed around and everything. She was kind of adopted, eventually learned to speak English. Now, after she learned how to communicate properly with the folks around her, um, she stated that the boy and her were brother and sister, and they had to come from a place called the Land of Saint Martin, where it was always perpetually twilight and green in color. They weren't sure where their homeland was, how to get back there, how to locate it, or anything. But they did say that they could see a place across a vast river that was illuminated at all times. And she remembered that they were looking for her father's herds of sheep or cattle. They followed them into a cavern where they heard the sound of bells. Entranced, they wandered through the darkness for a long time until they arrived at another mouth of the cave, where they were blinded by glaring light. After a while, they kind of like reacclimated to being outside of the cave and ended up running out from out into the fields and everything, where they were caught by the villagers at this point. After they're able to kind of get this across to people, people obviously were like, not sure what you're talking about. But the girl didn't seem to be like fantasizing in any way. It wasn't like she was like, didn't seem to be making it up. Now, after a while, she was able to kind of like assimilate into the culture, ended up getting married after a while to one of the local kind of nobles and everything. And by all accounts, lived out a normal life after this. Now, after she especially uh, started to eat regular food and everything around the time of the baptism, the green hue to her skin ended up fading. And she looked, by all accounts, normal at that point, had a normal skin tone. And again, lived out the rest of her life. Reading that part of the story, I'm obviously like, well, this seems crazy. This has to just be like a made up kind of thing. But after looking into it a lot closer, there is a abbot named Ralph Conshall and William of Newburgh, who were two kind of historians and writers at the time. Both documented this from nearby towns at the time. So it's like contemporary accounts, not like it was written 500 years later. They were contemporary. As a result, there seems to be a lot of even skeptics that think that from a provenance standpoint, this story does seem to be true in the sense of the kind of the facts of the case.
So, I mean, there's a couple different aspects of this. One is the green skin, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking that's not okay. It's not normal, but it's not unheard of. I mean, we're very familiar with, say, like the blue fugates. Are you familiar with
Mm-hmm. Right.
the
That's a
okay,
good
the blue?
example. Yeah.
And I figured you were maybe gonna lead that way, but the very short story is, well, if you're not familiar, you can look up the blue fugates or the blue people of Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
There was also a man who, because of silver poisoning, if I remember correctly,
Right.
within the last 20 years, who had a very dark blue
Blue. Yep.
tint to his
Mm-hmm.
skin. Apparently, that's a medical condition known as gobulimia.
Better than I would have
Ah,
done.
sorry, sorry for slaughtering that word, but my thought is that so we know of at least a couple different ways by which people can get that bluish tint to their
Mm-hmm.
skin. Could this not be a condition like that? So that's the first thing,
Mm-hmm.
is the skin tint is very weird. It's not entirely unheard of. I'm kind of surprised that the reaction wasn't stronger against the children, and maybe it was because they were young children that
Mm-hmm.
there wasn't, because that would have to be a very shocking thing to see.
For
But
sure.
because it seems to be corrected by the food that they eat, I think we can assume that there must be something they were either living amongst, like silver poisoning, or
Mm-hmm.
consuming, that had rendered them that way. But then the second part of this story is, well, where did they come from? And was it that they weren't speaking English, or because here's the other thing.
Yeah, yeah.
England at that time, this was not long after the Norman conquest, and the
Mm-hmm.
official language. This was a very tumultuous linguistic period in the British Isles because the official state language at that time was an older form of French.
Mm-hmm.
So were they French speaking and somehow got way out in the sticks, way away from, or were they speaking a very different dialect, or possibly Welsh or some other? There's so many of these little. It's a very big world
Mm-hmm.
back then. So, but
So
again, the bottom line is the second big question is, well, from where
where?
did they come?
Right. So when it comes to the color of the skin, and we're going to hit all the mundane explanations first, obviously. The green skin, there definitely can be, like you said, natural conditions that people have. Some of those maybe are hereditary, so the odds of having two children that have it maybe aren't as crazy as you think. There were people that I found talking about how there was flint mines nearby, that maybe if those were the caves they were in, maybe there was some sort of actual like staining, like not just dirt, but like staining that could have happened to the skin. But a few other people were kind of saying that wasn't, like you'd have to have a lot of flint on you for a long time, not just merely walking through a mine. So it could be environmental. I mean, we know that sloths get like algae on them and stuff. So
Yeah,
maybe, so it could have been something like that,
these could have
maybe.
been very lazy kids.
Hmm.
Or they, but I mean,
Right.
they, and the people dismissing the Flint thing, I don't know how much it takes,
Right.
but they
Yeah.
could have very easily been working within that, or,
Right.
maybe that was the family industry.
Right. Right. And I think so. The green thing is obviously one thing. The fact that I think that it went away, for a lot of people proves that it was like a mundane explanation for why their skin was that way. Now you mentioned like where they came from. Obviously, like England is an area that has lots of cultural diversity in it and everything, like you were mentioning, especially at this time with different languages. So coming across someone who spoke a language that you didn't know was probably pretty common. But it sounds like from these accounts that nobody knew what these people were speaking. It wasn't like just the average person didn't know, but even the educated people of the church didn't know what they were speaking.
I don't know, maybe they were from Wales. I hear some
Right.
British folk talk about the Welsh and as
Hmm.
being very unique
Yeah.
linguistically.
And what I saw a few people saying on a few different papers and books online is they think that if you do look at where Woolpit is, northwest of there, not far but not close, there is a place called Fornham, Fornham, Saint Martin. So it's possible that that was where they came from, was this St. Martin's. She called it St. Martin's Land. Now, the possible explanation for the unknown language, not just foreign language, but unknown language to these people, was around that time you had lots of Flemish settlers from Flanders and Belgium, which isn't like it's from the other side of the world, but you can understand how folks in this time period may have never heard Welsh before. Not Welsh, Flemish, and
Yeah,
before.
definitely could. Definitely could. And no, go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so that doesn't explain why over time people didn't figure out like, oh, maybe they're talking about St. Martin's, like just up the road a good ways. So it doesn't seem to answer that satisfactorily enough for me. but but it could be a documentation thing. Maybe some people were like, oh, maybe it's St. Martin's after a while, once they learned, hey, there's Flemish people up there. Never heard that language before.
I don't know. I think about this. The average person probably. I'm under the historical impression that the average person did not travel very much from the place of their birth in this time. I mean, we're talking about the 12th century, right?
Right, right.
I'm often reminded of a letter Freud sent back to a friend in
Mm-hmm.
early 1900s. His son had moved to another city. He had gone by train, and he had paid to telegraph back to his father, Sigmund
Mm-hmm.
Freud, that he had arrived safely, and Freud's friend wrote to him and say, "Wow, what a great thing that we have this technology that not only was
Mm-hmm.
your son able to move, but he was able to get there safely, cleanly. He was able to let you know pretty
Right,
soon
right.
thereafter." And Freud wrote back saying something to the effect that, "Well, yeah, but if we didn't have the train, my son may not have ever moved that far away. I'd never have had to worry about him
Yeah,
traveling in such a manner." I wonder if, yeah, it was a tumultuous linguistic period. Yes, there were many more dialects than maybe we recognize today. Yes, the language was evolving at an accelerated pace,
right.
but there's not a lot of people. Like, if you lived the overwhelming majority of your life within a 15-mile area, encountering some Flemish, encountering even some Scandinavian languages may be very, but yet there are people mobile enough. What I'm curious about is, were the parents looking for these children? It obviously, did something come of them that they, how long did it take for this young child to learn English enough to
Mm-hmm.
be able to speak with, probably not terribly long, but probably at
A
least a
while,
year or so to
right.
be able to. But also, I don't know if she would have been completely removed, only because she says the name of the town, and obviously she knew it is
Mm-hmm.
an English word. So I think that recent immigrant is probably a very likely scenario.
Right. And I just looked up on Google Maps. It is just over 12 miles between the two, like by road. But again, 12, like you're saying, 12 miles today versus 12 miles in the 1100s are
Right.
two very different things.
And I don't think it's not a distance crazy enough to assume that children
Couldn't
who
have
are
walked it.
lost and just walking and walking, wouldn't have. I mean, they
Hmm.
definitely could do that in a matter of a couple days, or maybe
Right.
even a day if they're really
Hmm.
motivated. But
Right. And again, in the sources they mention, like I said, there's these two main sources that people kind of point to. Like the girl who later went by the name of Agnes, ended up, originally saying that they were tending to her father's flock. So they obviously had some family, but like the reason this place is called Wool Pit, you can imagine a scenario where a 1100s farmer or shepherd loses their two kids, and 12 miles might be too far to go look at that point. If you don't, like, if you think there are wolves out there.
right.
So it's, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily fair or accurate for us to put like our those interpretations like on them.
And I'll say this real quick. I don't have it with me, so I can't recall the title, but I've been reading a book recently, which our friend Brian sent me for a
Nice.
gift. So thank you, Brian. And it's all about life before, not just before electric light, but even before gas light. And it
Yeah.
talks about darkness. And I'm reading through a chapter where people are like, one young lady, for example, in the 15th century was noted to have diverted slightly from a well-worn path at night and fell into a
Oh,
freshly dug grave and died.
right.
It's
Yeah.
there is so it's so dark.
We think, yeah. Yeah.
It's so dark, and yeah, it's, you were in a very real way taking your life into your own hands, because any stumble, any
Right.
misstep, and there are so many historical examples in this book that are documented,
Mm-hmm.
and that's in, the rural lands, let
Mm-hmm.
alone the different issues that one finds in the urban centers.
Right. Right. No, I think that's a good point. And
And the child's story, it makes it sound like they left at night.
right. Right. And travel through a cave. And again, there's caves all over these places. So like again, like their stories do check out in that sense. But so then you might be asking yourself, well, why does this story persist as a possible paranormal story? A lot of that has to do with how easy it is to draw correlations from this story to other paranormal silos or realms or whatever. One of the first is something we talk about quite often on here is, was there a fairy element to this? They came from another place. How they described this city. or this place where they came from, like her description doesn't match that Forham St. Martin's. There's no major river, there's no lit up city, it's not in perpetual twilight, it doesn't answer those questions. But that does sound like an underworld that that like the Fae might be occupying.
Well, one thing I'll say to that real quick is just if it were a story from 50 years ago, from 60 years ago, I think people would be talking extraterrestrial or time travel. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think they would be going into the Fey realm or the fairy
Right.
realm. I think because it's a story of antiquity, I
Mm-hmm.
think we're going with
It
these
seems
older things.
right. Now, since you mentioned it, there are people who think that these were actually extraterrestrials as well, because in a lot of these sources they say in the 1100s in England there are a lot of historical, what could be interpreted as UFO sightings, airships, things like that, strange lights in the sky. So there are people out there who kind of talk about how this might have been the result of some kind of UFO flap, and these were two humans, aliens, whatever, that were left behind by the aliens. Which again, like I feel like we're answering one mystery with another there, kind of. I don't know if that's where you should go first, but a lot of people like that element, and that goes along really well. Again, like I said, with the Fae thing, there's a lot of people who think alien phenomena and Fae phenomena are much closer than not. But I completely agree that I think the alien thing is kind of like a modern interpretation, whereas the Fae element might be a more contemporary curiosity about the story. Now, one of the things that this kind of led me down, like we mentioned earlier, you just dig into these sometimes and you don't know where you're going to end up. Nick, are you familiar with Admiral Richard Byrd by chance? Does that name ring a bell?
Yeah, gosh, I hope I don't screw this up. He wasn't the first to the
Yeah.
South
Yep.
Pole, right?
Yep.
Okay,
So
yes.
so there is a book that he released in I'm not sure when the book came out. Let me check real quick. He had journals that were then released in a book, and that was about his travels in the 60s, going over Antarctica. And he is one of the original people that talked about this idea of a hole at the bottom of Antarctica to a hollow Earth, which I've always just thought is a fantastic story. Like the whole hollow earth thing I think makes zero actual sense, but from a storytelling standpoint, boy is it cool, because what it gives us is it gives us like a parallel world that could be existing alongside of ours that is just unseen and unbeknownst, which is a way that people can look at the other, look at fairies, look at whatever. And this is an actual like Navy admiral writing about this in his journals.
Yeah, now, wasn't he did he live like into the 1960s? Am I wrong in saying that?
Yeah, I believe these were published in the mid '60s. Yeah,
Okay,
initially.
so like now if he had published that in say again the 17th century,
Hmm.
yeah, it's just as you said the whole Hollow Earth thing is really just does not hold up to
Does it hold the crust up? Yeah,
to a cold breath of scrutiny in
yeah.
this day and age in our understanding of
Right,
geology and everything.
right,
But
right.
so for him to be proposing for, and this is one of those things that's difficult to wrap one's head around. There
Right.
are people who are capable of great brilliance and
Hmm.
daring and have the muster to do difficult things
Yes.
who believe very silly
Yes.
things at the same time.
That's a
I think
kind way
this
of
is
putting it.
one of
Yeah.
those.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is one of an example of that.
Agreed.
And I
Agreed.
think what was it? I heard it said before by a philosopher, something to the effect that smart people can believe stupid things. They're
Hmm.
better at it because they are able to justify it with, well argued things,
Dude.
ignoring, the problem is still a silly belief.
Well, right. And I think what we're seeing in cases like that, like you're mentioning, is it's the kind of marrying of both sophistry and an intense need for answers. because that's what I think you get when you get this whole Hollow Earth thing. Which again, we probably should do a whole episode on this
I was
book.
going to say
Um,
this took a very different. We said wool pit. I mean,
yeah,
we're talking about pits. We're not talking about
right,
great.
right, exactly, and that's what. But again, that's why I kept seeing this pop up, and I kept recognizing like the idea of the whole Hollow Earth thing. And I'm like, who? I'm like, didn't someone else like document this? And I went on one of my discords, and folks were kind enough to be like, "Oh, you talking about the Admiral Byrd thing?" And I was like, "Yes, that." And as I kept seeing that stuff referenced about like in Antarctica and everything, and I think that's like why people gravitate towards that stuff because it is. Again, we've talked about this before, not to get like too dark or anything, but like the world can be pretty tough to take sometimes when you see everything that's going on. And you can understand how, like you said, normal people or great minds can look for excuses or other ways to interpret the world that might be more in line with what you would hope. And I think especially when you're talking about, transversing Antarctica, like you're really kind of saying like, okay, we found everything now on like the crust of the earth. And I think people who explore especially want to always think, oh well, there's one more thing. There's another entrance over there we can go check. And
Another layer to the onion.
right, right, another layer to the unknown. And that's why when I kept seeing this stuff pop up in the Wool Pit stuff, which like you said is a pretty like I think we can all agree the mundane explanation for these kids showing up is by far the Occam's razor. Some of the documentation around the elements of the story might not be true in the sense that like when I said that she said that like there was a river near her town, that just might have not been true. But like I said, we have these two documents from these writers who, even skeptics seem to agree online, like this thing happened, but the why offers up all of these other, it just makes people think about different things.
Yeah, I think if we broke down the story into its most basic elements,
Mm-hmm.
with the most mundane explanation, two children in the night got lost and kept wandering and just
Mm-hmm.
kept wandering, ended up encountering people, and they had likely been damaged in some way by either the staining of the skin
Mm-hmm.
or by some internal thing that gave their
Malnourishment. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Something.
and now they're thrust into another place where they don't know, they're not able to communicate with people effectively.
Mm-hmm.
She loses her brother who either dies
Which is probably
from
traumatic. Yeah.
what right exactly, and he either dies from what they were already going through or because death is even back then, or rather especially back then, was
Mm-hmm.
a rather mundane thing.
Right. Right. Which we talked about. Yeah.
And so she gets to a point where she's able to describe their story, but she's describing a story that she's already losing elements to, and she's
Right.
describing a story that she bore witness to as a young child,
Mm-hmm.
likely in a new world to her, you know?
Right. And so you can understand how some of those elements could get uh confused and mixed up, you
Yeah.
know.
So
Um
I'm curious, were you able to find, was there much documentation of her life beyond her marrying? And you said she married into nobility?
yeah, she married a royal official named Richard Bear or Barr Barre, just kind of lived out her life. There are I saw this term or these two terms in a few of the writings saying that whenever she was employed as a servant and everything and was dealing with people a lot, the term very wanton and impudent came up a few times. So it sounds like she wasn't like a terribly fun person to be around or terribly kind. But again, like you said, probably had some very traumatic events when she was younger.
I was going to say,
And
imagine the questions that she had.
right, like, oh, aren't you the person who used to be green who showed up in the
Well,
fields
yeah,
one day?
even
Like it's
that,
just,
but
yeah,
even
like,
that, but you got to wonder, like, what did she remember much of her life before?
right.
What was her life like before? Was she in a great place before, maybe? And
Who,
she has questions about, like, well, where are her parents and
right,
all that? Or
right. Yeah.
I don't know.
There's so many unknowns, and that's why I think the sad thing is just like these two kids had to go through this awful thing. Like that shouldn't be lost. Um, but I did,
Speaking,
yeah, go
sorry,
ahead. Sorry.
speaking of loss, we do have to wonder, in the 900 some years since this all occurred,
Mm-hmm.
give or take, what information, what documentation did they have then that's being lost to us now?
Right, like because like, we have these two contemporary documents. There may have been more that had
Exactly.
more or different information. Now, what it does seem like is the two documents from William of Newburgh and Ralph of Conchal, they do match up pretty well for the most part. So it seems like those are like things that do match are probably the quote unquote facts of the case. But yeah, who knows how many other things were written either at that time or shortly after that may have been like, hey, here's what happened, that we just have
Yeah.
been lost to time. One
Or
way
even
another.
much later when she had a better grasp of the language. But yes, the bottom
Right.
line is there's almost certainly more to the story that we'll likely never know.